Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast.
Welcome to Musical Talk and to an episode celebrating 100 years. 100 years of what, though, you might ask? Well, here to discuss that very question with me, vital though it is Thos.
Hello, that's me. I've got a question for you. 100 years of what, Tim?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that. On the 22nd of November 2013, it will be 100 years since the birth of the celebrated British composer, conveniently called Benjamin Britten, and not to be confused with Benjamin Button. Entirely different character, although in some ways not, interestingly.
A different episode entirely, I think.
A different episode entirely.
Benjamin Britten. Now, why is he important?
We said that at the same time. Well,
it must be a good question, then.
He's important as a composer, and he's important as a classical composer, and you might wonder, where does he cross over with musical theatre? Well, in several different areas, and particularly because he was a composer, a notable composer, and one of the, you might say, one of the last very notable composers of opera, as a British composer, that is.
And in English, of course.
And in English. The piece of his that perhaps has entered what they call the standard repertoire in the last, and perhaps the last one to enter in the last 50 years, is Peter Grimes, which was his early opera, 1948, which describes the story of an outsider, based very much on the Suffolk villages that he knew very well. And Peter Grimes, and it's a very serious piece in which Peter Grimes, this fisherman, an apprentice of his, dies, and it's basically about the suspicion of the community that he lives in, the very sort of small, close-knit community, and it's generally thought of as a great work. We're not going to focus too much on that today because I thought we would talk about some of the other things that we're familiar with, and in particular we recently saw a production of a very specific sort of community opera that he wrote a bit later, about 10 years later, in 1958, known as Noah's Flood, or Noye's Flood, if you take it at face value.
Before we go any further, though, Tim, I think some people are going to say, not least me, historically at least, Benjamin Britten, yes, I mean, I've heard of him as a classical composer, which is how he's generally described, even though it's modern classical music, if that makes sense. He's certainly a modernist composer. And you've sort of touched upon why, you know, he's one of the great composers of opera in particular, and so that's musical theatre. But actually, I think there's a lot more to him. And I think it might just be useful to explain how, in my life, which overlapped briefly with his, as he died in the 70s,
75,
when I was a little boy,
yeah,
how I've come across him and why I think he's important in relation to musical theatre, even though some of these are slightly tangential points. And I think most people will know a piece of music called The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra.
Yes.
Which he wrote for children as a guide to the orchestra, which has been adapted 1,000 times. And whenever you were at school, you know, quite often, certainly in the 70s and 80s, when you had a music class, certainly in your primary school, you'd be played Peter and the Wolf, you'd be played Saint-Saëns' Carnival of Animals, and you'd be played The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. So it became one of those...
With or without narration, and often with.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
And indeed, it's been adapted with Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck doing the narration in cartoon versions as well.
Indeed, yeah.
So it is a widely accepted entree into classical music for children.
Mine was Richard Baker, you know.
Yes,
the narration of The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra.
Well, interestingly, I had The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra on a cassette,
yes.
And on the other side was Peter and the Wolf, narrated by Michael Flanders. And the reason I mention that is because Michael Flanders is one half of Flanders and Swan, and Flanders and Swan also touched upon Benjamin Britten's work in a fantastic piece called Guide to Britain, which more or less actually went through his entire career from his very early stuff right to the very end in a comic way. But whilst that's a fantastic piece of work, I think what it really does more than anything else is actually say how accessible Benjamin Britten was seen to be across the board. You could make jokes about Benjamin Britten's career and excerpts from the opera to the common man, in a dreadful phrase, and people would understand.
And most of the middle classes would understand them, exactly.
Yes, all right.
He would appear, I mean, obviously a lot of his works would appear on the Third programme and on Radio 3 as it later became, and a lot of his stuff was of course done in the great opera houses of London, and a lot of his stuff would be familiar to people, perhaps through his folk song arrangements as well, which Joyce Grenfell, a favourite comic of mine, once satirised in a sort of folk arrangement called Old Willy Waddle. Although the tune is very simple and basic, as it always was with Britten's folk arrangement, he arranged the actual tune. Old Willie Waddle is a right wise man, goes to bed on Fridays, or that's her version of what Benjamin Britten sounded like to her. But there's always, underneath it, there's an atonal, 12-tone type of accompaniment that actually doesn't sound at all harmonious and isn't the traditional sort of stuff you might expect even from, I don't know, Percy Grainger or the people that came before Britain with their interest in folk music.
Actually, I'd just like to make another step away there in two different directions, because Dudley Moore, famous jazz pianist and comic in the 60s, used to write mock Benjamin Britten folk songs.
Oh, right, okay.
That was part of his act, and he's recorded a few of them. And even more bizarrely, possibly I think the most famous of the folk songs, and one that Flanders and Swan pick up, which is the one that goes da 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 da. I think it's called The Farmer's Son or something like that. I mean, it's a piece of folk music before Benjamin Britten, but when I was a boy, there was a children's programme for pre-nursery almost, really, called Hickory House, and that was the theme tune.
Oh, right, okay.
I hadn't realised how early I was getting my Britten in those days.
I think one of the things that he brought to certainly popular culture also was that he had an enormous interest and respect for the past. And he wasn't just a modernist in the sense of wanting to do everything new. He was a modernist in the sense of wanting to reinvent the ancient and the old. And
he brought his past with him. Or
very much
past,
so, yes. Or very much the past. I mean, for example, if you look through the list of the operas that he wrote, you've got Peter Grimes, which of course is set in this very traditional village and features the bells of the church in the rhythms of it, and all sorts of
agrarian life at the core
yes,
of it.
Yes. You've got pieces like like Gloriana, which was of course based on the story of Elizabeth I, and which was written because he was a sort of composer laureate, if you like, at this sort of time.
Master of the Queen's music.
He never held the post, but
he might as well have done.
Exactly. And that was written to commemorate the coronation in
of Elizabeth II.
Of Elizabeth II.
So as you say, taking the past to make the future work.
Yes. There's also A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is one of the operas, again, which is uses the Shakespeare texts rather than sort of setting a new one or doing an innovative thing. Adapted, obviously, and cut down significantly, but very sympathetically. And in fact, I think it was a bit of a point of pride for them that there's only one invented line in it, which they have to just breach. It's in the very first scene, because Shakespeare's play has 5 acts, and they sort of cut the first of the 5 acts entirely, because all that is a lot of people arguing about whether Helena and Demetrius, Helena and Hermia can marry, and not all of them together, obviously, although various permutations do happen throughout the play. And instead they cut that and go straight to the bit where they've run away into the woods, for the evening, and there the sharp Athenian law compelling thee to marry with Demetrius, which are the few words that they just had to make up to just bridge that whole Act 1. Not bad, actually, packing an entire Act 1 of Shakespeare into one made-up line.
I thought you were going to say something very anachronistic, like, hang on, bottom, my phone's ringing.
Yes, exactly, yeah. But no, it was very sympathetic to the past. And not only that, but, I mean, a lot of the... you've got The Little Sweet, which is a sort of Victorian melodrama, and of course
Albert Herring,
and
which is almost his comic opera, isn't it?
Yes,
it's not quite, but it's it's the one that nods most to Gilbert and Sullivan.
Yes, it does. Yeah, it's sort of closest to operetta, and you've also got.
Just briefly, I should say that in the 80s, when they were televising Gilbert and Sullivan on television, I don't know if you're following me there.
Best possible way to do it.
Absolutely, the one non-Savoy opera that they did in that series was Albert Herring.
Ah, okay, interesting.
That's where I saw my first. At least partly saw some of my first Britain on television. Yes,
and although he was famous as a sort of because he'd reached that sort of level of popular culture knowledge as therefore the atonal composer, or not atonal because he wrote very little atonal music, but 12-tonal or dissonant type of composer. That was sort of, he was thought of as the that's how you typified that sort of thing if you weren't thinking of, I don't know, Stravinsky, of course, who'd written A Rite of Spring.
But it's one of the reasons he's so spoofed in this country, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
But it's affectionate spoofing, I think.
People found it peculiar, but of course it's also forgotten that he was a very tuneful composer as well, and I think people forget very much that you've got things like, I mentioned it before, Sunday Morning from the Sea Interludes from Peter Grimes, which is a piece of early minimalism really, and very tonal. It's got a sort of dum bum 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 bum. It's very sort of.
Oh, do you know that sounded like Sondheim?
Well, you might think of Sondheim, and you might think of Michael.
I'm doing so now.
Go on, off you go.
Done it.
Very nice. Michael Nyman, I think, also would have been heavily influenced by that, and a lot of the minimalist composers, even possibly Steve Reich. One of the reasons for that, by the way, was that Britain was influenced or was friends with a guy called Colin McFay, who was a great researcher of gamelan music and other Eastern music. So in fact, a lot of minimalism comes to us via that route, and also via people like Debussy and people like that as well, who also were very obsessed with gamelan music back in the very early days of Britain's life. Anyway, that's by the by. These operas all, as I say, are strong, more than a tip of the hat to the past, very much attempting to sort of re-represent the past in a contemporary musical voice, but not necessarily in terms of the spirit of it.
But he saw himself in the tradition, not outside of the tradition. Indeed,
Very much
I think... well, we know from our own researches that he was deemed to be the fourth B, the three Bs of music were Bach, Beethoven and Brahms, aren't they?
And he hoped very much that the fourth will be Britten. And
yes, and I think it is.
I think it was his mother, isn't it, who was very convinced that should be the case.
Well, it was either him or Banana Rama.
Yes. Difficult. Yes, anyway, changing the topic of this episode momentarily. No. I was quite interested to talk about one piece of Britain that I do know very well, and which we saw recently at the Festival Hall, which have been reviving various bits of Britain as part of the centenary celebrations this year. Noah's Flood, which we haven't really spoken about up till now.
And we should, because, amongst other things, it's one of the most accessible for a starter.
Yes.
It also involves children, and you'll explain that it's community, family, theatre in every possible sense. Whilst it doesn't pull its punches. So I think, anyone saying, well, hang on a minute, why are we just talking about Benjamin Britten? This is a genuine piece of musical theatre. It's not jazz hands musical theatre, but it is it's a fantastic piece of all-encompassing, all-embracing. Its spectacular nature comes from the being in the round and engaging the audience by intimate connection, which you don't actually get sometimes in the proscenium arch theatre.
Yes, it's not. It was performed in a church first, so that was the original setting of it. It's a very churchy story. Obviously, it's the story of Noah and the flood, and the text is based on the medieval Chester miracle play. And as a lot of people will know, there are a cycle of what they call mystery plays and also miracle plays, which were performed by the guilds of various towns in various towns. So there's a York cycle, there's a Wakefield cycle, and there are others as well.
And they're all religious based, aren't they?
Yes.
Biblical.
They were essentially a way back in the day and in the medieval period of communicating biblical stories to people who weren't literate, who wouldn't have perhaps been able to know of them, or perhaps to see them in quite such clear detail. Under other circumstances, and it was a community effort. So they were each of the plays was performed by a guild, or craftsmen, or just ordinary people who would have wheeled their carts around doing these plays right across an entire sort of day, basically. Yes. So one day taken out to sort of tell biblical stories. To
this day, I mean, things like this are still done at Easter, aren't they? They are the religious festivals.
Oh, yes.
The few religious festivals that
still
the
York
exist in the
cycle
canon.
continues,
yes.
Yeah, absolutely, and focuses a lot of it on the Passion and the story of Christ. But also you get these. But
you can have one with two zebras.
Tony Harris, in fact, recast them. They did it at the National Theatre
some years ago,
more than 20 years ago, as the mystery plays or as the mysteries, and the first one was the Nativity, but in fact it also incorporated the whole of the Old Testament as well in the first act.
While stocks last.
And then off into the Nativity story. And it's done very comically. It's a very earthy sort of humour. It's not what we think of as sort of,
it's not pious.
No, that's right. The reverent presentation of religious stories, which, while not a Victorian invention,
was enhanced by Victorian.
We're talking about pre-Puritanism here.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the Nativity story, which Britain never set, there's the comical scene between Mary and Joseph, where Joseph comes home and she's saying, "Well, I'm pregnant," and he says, "What?" And she's like, "Well, it was God actually who's impregnated me," and a certain enjoyment, yes, is had with the sort of disbelief of Joseph at this rather tall tale.
And racy in a way, isn't it? Yes, because it's actually about real human life. Biblical stories.
Anyone who knows Chaucer knows that the medieval, it was a very frank sort of time. So Noah's Flood sets the story by starting with the speech of God, and then we get obviously we meet Noah and we meet his sons and we meet his sons' wives and so on, and they all talk about the things they're going to do in the ark, and then we meet this very non-biblical character, Mrs. Noah,
dissolute.
Who's very dissolute, who's sort of
by
enjoys
non-biblical,
drinking.
You mean she is in the Bible? She's just not pious.
She's in the Bible, and I think there are certain features of her story that are biblical, but a lot of it is sort of played up for the drama of her being unwilling to go to the ark and having her gossips that are around her, and then
she's worldly,
having to be strong-armed, basically,
Yeah.
into the Ark.
After emotional blackmail from her own children has failed.
That's true.
Noah
yes.
sends his kids off to sort of plead with her.
I think they pick her up bodily in the end and cart her in. It leaves out all the stuff at the end of the biblical story, which is about uncovering his nakedness and all of this sort of stuff. It's still a little bit pious.
When the boat lands, as it were, that's when it finishes.
The story we get basically is a little bit of an enhanced version of the one that if you grew up from a Christian background, you might have got in Sunday school
or school assembly
or something like that. Because you would have learned about the rainbow and the raven and the raven being sent out and not coming back, and the dove coming back with an olive branch.
To this day, I can still remember the school assembly when I was 7 that finished with "God put a rainbow in the sky to remind us of His promise."
Really?
Even with
what
those
did that rhyme with?
Well, it wasn't rhyming. It was the 70s. No one did. It was all free-form, darling.
It was all free-form.
But the point was,
Cummings.
Yeah, but even with that intonation, I remember that so clearly.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, there was lots of songs about Noah, and I think the one I remember was "Who Built the Ark," and then apparently the alternative lyric was "No one."
Oh right.
Who built the Ark? No one. No one. Anyway.
Oh, I see. Well, I believe they went in 2 by 2.
Getting off topic here. So back to Britten and his amazing setting. He also
complete sidestep. The song "The Animals Went in 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah," isn't the same, but is almost exactly the same as "The Runaway Train Went Down the Track." There are slight differences, but...
Well, I'm glad you've managed to put that finally on the record here, even though it took this episode.
Listen up, folks.
So, the way it structures an opera is around 3 hymns. There's a first hymn, "Lord Jesus, Think on Me," which is a sort of a minor key hymn, and it's done in a very dramatic arrangement prior to a sort of very dramatic speech by God. There's the "Eternal Father, Strong to Save," which happens in the middle when the flood is happening, which is better known as "For Those in Peril on the Sea."
Yeah.
And that was chosen because it would have had a significant resonance for the congregation that were in seeing the very first performance of this, which was in 1958, on the 18th of June, in Orford Church. Might note the name Orford. Eileen Orford is the name of a significant character in Peter Grimes, in Suffolk, and it would have been a significant hymn to them because, of course, it was a fishing. These were fishing communities, and on the Suffolk coast that Britain knew very well
and lived round.
And it was the sort of hymn you might very well sing on a Sunday. Yeah. Because your husband or your father or whoever might very well be in peril on the sea at that very moment.
Also, a naval nation such as Britain, which up to 1958 it still was, would have a great understanding of any of the hymns which are based around, as you say, danger on the sea.
The final hymn, which comes after, obviously, they've all landed and got back out of the Ark and the rainbow's appearing and so on, is called the...
Is that because God put the rainbow in the sky to remind us of His promise?
Oh, that was the reason. I couldn't remember. I'm glad we had that mnemonic to remind us. Was that this is called "The Spacious Firmament on High," and the music of that, or the tune of that particular, and the accompaniment, I suppose, is Tallis's Canon, which is, again, would have been a very well-known piece of music to certainly that generation who might very well have learnt it in school.
Once again, goes back to this idea of being very much part of the tradition of musical history.
Very much.
I mean, Tallis is right at the beginning of British music in some sense.
It takes you a little bit back to things like Britten's, which he wrote quite early in his career, Songs from Friday Afternoons, which was a sort of recollection of a lot of the things that one might do in music lessons. The sort of old tunes you might learn in music lessons and so on. And indeed, later on the Spring Symphony, you've got things like he does a big setting of "Summer Is a Comin' In" again, which is the sort of thing that kids would learn in primary school.
And I believe is Britain's oldest known song.
It is.
Well, the oldest known song in England.
Yes, English. In English, that's right, yes.
Yes.
When we say Britain's oldest known song, of course, we're referring to the country, not the...
I'm talking the British Isles, yes. Yes, of course.
But yes, it is I think it's the earliest recorded score that has English words.
Yeah.
Yes, "Summer Is a Comin' In," well, barely English, but "Summer Is..." just to digress into that, which I'm very fond of that song. "Summer Is a Comin' In," it features also heavily in The Wicker Man as an example of sort of, the pre-Christian England or the barely Christian England. "Summer is a comin' in, loud now sing cuckoo, blow..." Oh gosh, can't remember this. "Bloweth mead and groweth seed and spring the wood anew, sing cuckoo. And then you now bleateth after calf, loweth after calf. You now bleateth after lamb, loweth after calf the cow. Bullock starteth, harter verteth, Mary sing cuckoo." Now, they never told us what that meant, but the vertith bit, harter vertith, that's the heart farts, basically.
Oh, is it?
That's what it means. So
And
The
yet,
sound of spring all around us.
and more parochially, anyone who's seen Bagpuss,
Yes.
the song "We Will Fix It" is the tune.
Yes,
So you
it is.
do know the oldest song in English.
There we are, recreated for you. Noah's Flood, back to that again. So we talked about the structure, and we talked about how it's structured around these hymns. So
But there's more than just the hymns.
Well,
it's
indeed.
Not, it's just not. It's
well, the
not a
hymns were-
hymny piece.
The hymns
is it?
would have been an entree for the
Yeah.
audience, because who probably would have known all of those
Yeah.
hymns and would have been able to sing along. So the entire congregation joins in. But as the notes of the first hymn fade away, we hear the voice of God, as one does, played originally by Trevor Anthony, a Welsh singer, who, if you have a copy of the original recording, or if you hear a copy of the original recording, it's a very operatic sort of performance. But it's spoken. I, God, that all this world hath wrought, heaven and earth and all of naught, and so on. And so he commissions Noah to make the ark, specifying exactly how many cubits it must be and all these things. And Noah, originally played by Owen Brannigan, is a strong sort of baritone part, and again has a very, I don't know how to describe it really, but quite a formal way of expressing himself. And his wife is a contralto, like a very low alto. And who therefore sounds like she smoked sort of 40 Benson and Hedges.
Come on in, Noah, if you fancy it.
A couple of interesting original cast members. One particularly one was there was a part of Japhet, so the Shem, Ham and Japhet, as they were called in the Chester Miracle play.
These are the sons.
Shem, Ham and Japheth, as we know them from the biblical version. Japhet was Britten cast a very young actor who was later to go on to enormous success in musical theatre. His name was Michael Crawford.
Barnum.
Indeed. Well, Barnum, and of course Hello Dolly, he was in the film of, and
A squillion other things.
famously of all, The Phantom of the Opera, of course. He rewrote it for him because his voice, Michael Crawford, had broken, and the part was rewritten. Because I always must admit, I thought of Japhet as the younger of the sons, although sources differ as to which is the elder. And he rewrote it for his newly minted tenor voice, so it was his first sort of big sing, basically.
By the way, Owen Brannigan has also recorded Gilbert and Sullivan on many non-D'Oyly Carte recordings. When the D'Oyly Carte copyright, when Sullivan went out of copyright, other people recorded the operetta, and Owen Brannigan had a regular role in some of those.
Oh, okay, interesting. So Noah goes through the traditional story, and we meet all of the characters of the story, and then we have a main orchestra, and we have the main sort of professional cast of the thing, and then behind all of that is the community. So very much in the spirit of the original Chester plays, Britten was keen to have a lot of, there were local school children involved, there were amateur performers, and a lot of the school kids would have been dressed up as the animals, basically, and they do the Kyrie eleison section, which is basically where they populate the ark.
Now, you've just called that the Kyrie
eleison section,
which is what they're singing, and when I saw it, it was the bit I liked the most. I found that the most oddly tuneful, in a strange way, because we as an audience it was done in the round essentially, and we were standing right next to the base of the ark.
This was this year's
at
production,
the Royal Festival Hall.
yes,
That's right.
indeed.
And the children all
not so much in the round, but actually what you'd call a promenade performance. Like we actually stood in the middle, and the cast moved among us, didn't they?
They did indeed, and that was a marvellously absorbing, in the sense that you felt immersed. It was an immersive experience.
Yes.
But as they all came at you from all directions, because the Royal Festival Hall is a big old place, singing the Kyrie bit.
Yes, Kyrie eleison.
It was startlingly effective in drawing one in.
Yes, exactly.
Even though it's not,
and
I couldn't whistle it, but
and in the original, I could whistle it. In the original, which I'll do in a second. In the original production, of course, they would have come through the aisle and again through the audience, and it would have again seen participants. Very much in the spirit of the original plays, because these would have been done in like courtyards and streets and all over the town. Basically, they wouldn't have been there wouldn't have been enough theatres to do them in.
Not in a building.
And probably no theatres at all, or no dedicated theatres. There would have been the mystery plays, certainly they wheeled around on carts, and then they sort of set up shop and did the play.
The Passion plays are still done outside.
Yes, that's the same thing, really. Yes, let me... which is the basic tune for the Kyrie eleison. Very simple, very naive, very much sort of, to remind one of
the dumb animals.
Yes. And of sort of, medieval music, basically.
Yeah. But for me, that was the moment I enjoyed the absolute most. I felt fully immersed.
and lots of rounds as well. That tune actually neatly fits together so that you've got Hear a Fowler's Lesson More, and then Heron's Owls, Bittern Jackdaw, and then you've got the next couple, Ham and Mrs. Ham, going, and here are cocks, kites, crows, rookies, ravens, many rows, and so on. The round is a very significant sort of part of how Noah's flood works. They go into the flood. We all sing Eternal Father, Strong to Save, and so on. And of course, these aren't original medieval words, but more Victorian creations, those. And then we have a little ballet as well of the dove and the raven, who are, as you know, the raven disappears off and can't find anywhere to land, but the dove does bring back an olive branch.
These are the scouts, aren't they, looking for land?
Effectively, yes, that's right, exactly. And then finally we get...
penguin.
That's right. Yes, it's just as well he didn't, I think. It probably wouldn't have gone quite so well. And then finally into that last hymn, The Spacious Firmament on High, I was noticed about that it's a very eclectic arrangement, The Spacious Firmament on High. So there's the professional musicians. There's what they call the ripieno musicians, or the string parts. So you'd have like a main string section and a small orchestra, which were the professionals, and then behind those you would have the local school children with much simpler violin parts written for them, but they could play along.
Yeah.
As part of the hymn.
And once again, engaging the community.
Yeah.
And quite often the young community. I mean, this is the point I think is really relevant here. When we saw it, there were young people playing young people playing the sons professionally, but there were young people playing the animals that all go on, as you say, with the occasional chaperone. I noticed it was quite nice, obviously.
Yes.
There were young people in the orchestra
safety.
with the professionals.
Yes.
And there were many young people in the audience. I mean, partly friends and family.
Yeah.
But there was a real sense of family writ large, which is what community is, isn't it?
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
I really felt I was part of a much wider thing going on than the show. Sometimes when you see a show, think that's very nice, but it's all very containable in the distance.
Yeah.
Discreet. This wasn't. We were the sea essentially, and we were a maelstrom of humanity at the base of the ark.
I know I was.
Yes.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, of course, it is a family story. I mean, the story is of a man and his children and his children's wives who recreate humanity in, well, let's not go into that.
And irrespective of its biblical basis, it is one of the first stories that you're taught as a child, certainly in the Judeo-Christian tradition in this country. Every child knows the story of Noah's Ark, pretty much. It's
not just Judeo-Christian, because all the monotheistic religions, Islam also has the story as part of its with Noah, because obviously they have the Pentateuch and a lot of those things, the Jewish books, Islam having come later. Anyway, fascinating.
But there are sort of non-Noah flood stories as well, aren't there? So.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So they sing the Spacious Firmament, and one of the things notable about that is the instrumentation gets quite interesting when you get into the stuff that the kids are playing. So particularly there are these, what they call the slung mugs, which are basically these sort of camp style, I don't know what they call them, but they're sort of enamelled...
Bully beef tins.
Yes, that sort of enamelled mugs, basically, that just get hit. And what they're hit for is, this is in the second hymn, is the sound of the rain. So the first pitter-patter of the rain is signalled by the slung mugs, and at the end of the storm as well, and the flood, we get the last few drips as well that are signalled to us by these slung mugs, these very sort of folksy type of instruments that give us those sounds.
Percussion, but not from instruments properly.
And they come back at the end as well in the Spacious Firmament. So there's a moment. It does that thing of being a very traditional tune with unexpected harmonisations underneath it. Which is a very Britten thing to do. And I've always thought, perhaps just to show that he can do it, there's a beautiful, it's the verse that starts, "What though in solemn silence all move round the dark terrestrial ball." It's where the canon goes into half speed and double speed and normal speed, and so everyone is singing like at a different speed.
Different kinds of rounds,
and
but
it's all
with tempo.
Beautifully harmonised, and there isn't a single sort of dissonant note in it, and it's meant to sort of illustrate, as it were, the music of the spheres, And then we get into this final celebratory, which uses trumpets and the slung mugs and all kinds of percussion as well, almost firework-like explosions out of the orchestra. It's an amazing thing, and
it was interesting to watch you during that, if I may say, because, well, first of all, you knew it was coming.
Yeah.
But it was obviously a sublime experience for you, because you would genuinely on a kind of sort of high
Yes.
afterwards. You know, it was a piece of music which had moved you and excited you and taken you somewhere.
Yeah, it is. It's a very notable, musical moment, I suppose, and certainly for me. What I think you see with Noah's Flood as well is, as a community production, I mean, obviously these have been going on for centuries, clearly.
But not with this score.
Not with this sort of score. But I do think you also see the beginnings of maybe the school production. If you look at Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat,
Yes.
what is that if not a sort of a Noah's Flood, done
It's a biblical story
couple
with...
of 20 years later, but just with a much more sort of pop sensibility, basically, by that time. And certainly the use of the kid soprano chorus and all of that sort of stuff. There's a sort of flavour, if not the exact sort of tonal flavour to it. And there's no question Lloyd Webber would have been familiar with Noah's Flood and would certainly have known it. That makes you think you're in the same acoustic world, if not the same musical world, with Joseph. And a similar sort of, an Old Testament story told simply.
But I don't think it's significant or insignificant that, Britain is, despite Britain, I suspect, in the public consciousness being known, but not necessarily everyone knowing much music from him, the fact that so much that he wrote, Young Person's Guide, Noah's Flood, which is aimed at children as much as anyone, this is musical theatre.
Yes.
It is theatre with music, and it is a way into performance. It's a way into, modernistic music. I mean, let me ask you the question. Not just Noah's Flood, Noise Floody, but how influential is Benjamin Britten in musical theatre?
It's a difficult question.
And I'm using musical theatre in its modern sense here.
Yes, of course, yeah. It's a difficult question to answer because a lot of his stuff came out of traditions and wasn't necessarily something that went further. I suspect, although I've never traced it that closely, but you mentioned Sondheim earlier, and I think musically it would surprise me enormously if Sondheim wasn't acquainted with Britten. And I think in Sweeney Todd and in certain places, although perhaps you hear the influence of the 20th century French composers more, I think Britten, who was also influenced by the same composers, is a presence in Sondheim.
So in a way, he may not necessarily influence Sondheim, but they're both influenced by the same antecedents.
I think certainly Britten in his early stages was certainly very, very influenced by what had happened with modernist music in France particularly, and Sondheim clearly. I mean, it's written all over something like Sweeney Todd that Ravel was a significant influence, for example. But I think, you may well hear Britten occasionally in Sondheim without perhaps being able to be that specific. Yeah. Perhaps in Pacific Overtures, most of all, interestingly, because Britten was interested by, as a lot of composers were at that time, by music from, in general, the East, and in particular for Britain, Japan. Because one of his church parables is called Curlew River, and it's based on Sumdagower, which is it's one of the No plays. And which are famously, you'll know of Kabuki theatre, which was the heavy influence on Pacific Overtures. Is basically uses a lot of Kabuki style, and No plays was the flip side of that. No was, I think, what the men did in theatre, so it was an all male cast, and then Kabuki was originally an all women cast.
Oh, was it?
Yes.
All right.
And then they flipped it, and the men nicked that as well, and then it became an all male thing as well. So Pacific Overtures heavily influenced by the Kabuki tradition, and Sumdagower being one of the No plays. Simple, not a huge amount of dramatic action, but very, very stylised. And Curlew River is basically his take on that, which basically anglicises it. And when I say anglicised, I mean East anglicises it to Suffolk and to the Fenlands. So it makes for a very reflective sort of a score and for a thing. So I'd be surprised perhaps if there hadn't been maybe a little bit of traffic from Curlew River.
They're certainly mining similar themes, perhaps.
Yes. Conversely, you might say that, for example, the strand of musical theatre that emerged in Joan Littlewood, and specifically Lionel Bart's Oliver, might have had something to do with The Little Sweep, which is actually the thing that sounds most musical theatre of all of the Britten operas. The Little Sweep is a Victorian melodrama. That's the text that it's based on. And in a way, Peter Grimes is also a Victorian melodrama, but of a slightly different character. This is much more sort of, the sweep going up the chimney and being maltreated, and very much Oliver Twist type story.
It's a Dickens, isn't it?
And it has some of the most musical theatre cadence that you've got, which perhaps, abut on the jazz era or the operetta sort of time of musical theatre. It's difficult to quite get hold of the character, but I think there you might see a little bit of adjoinment, and it falls sort of in that the Little Sweep falls in that sort of period, that sort of in between period where we're between Showboat and Oklahoma, and it was actually first done in 1949.
Oh right, okay.
If my dates are right, probably maybe a little bit. I think
Oklahoma was
just earlier, a little bit before that, yes, but certainly was very newly minted at that time. It has this melodrama, and it was one of the first things that he wrote as a children's opera, and he went on to write others as well. There was the Golden Vanity, accompanied by not very much orchestration, and certainly the Golden Vanity is written only for piano, and lots of specifically boys' voices. It tells this, and it's based a little bit on William Blake, who wrote about the chimney sweep as well. So again, that's a very pathetic strand of poetry. Interesting.
But how do you tie it in with Joan Littlewood and Lionel Bart? Just the nature of the story and the Oliver-esqueness of it all?
I think it's the nature of the story perhaps is the biggest thing. But in terms of the tunes you hear, he's obviously taking a step down from the more obscure and more sophisticated sort of musical phrasing of that he's employed hitherto. Certainly than you would have heard in Peter Grimes, for example, and other things which would have preceded this, although not by very much actually. So it's written in a much more popular argot musically, and much more recognisably, popular idiom, basically. So that's fundamentally the basic. That would have gone on to influence all kinds of things, like Richard Rodney Bennett later on did All the King's Men, which was based on the story of the Civil War, for example, Humpty Dumpty, where there was a big setting of a folk song at the end of it, and again it had sort of moments of real popular song and moments of sort of slightly more sophisticated of singing. It really started a sort of tradition of the children's opera, which we all suffered from as children in the 70s and 80s. A lot of these quite buttoned down type of affairs before Lloyd Webber came along, really, and sort of funked it all up, I suppose.
Have to be careful how you say that.
Indeed.
Well, let's explore another line then, because we've mentioned all the way through folk song, and Michael Flanders in his excellent spoof says, every year he would write an oldie English folk song for Peter Pears to sing. Yes. Peter Pears being a very famous opera singer who was also his partner, as it happens.
And the love of his life, certainly.
But he did write folk songs in the same way, or revived them, or found ways of doing them in as standalones and also interpolated into texts, as you've just suggested, and hymns to a degree as well. Now, that's not an uncommon thing in musical theatre. It's not common, but it's not uncommon either.
Well, I mean, I suppose you've got the Beggar's Opera, if you think about that, which incorporates a lot of sort of popular song, and that's often seen as a proto-musical in its very early stages, reinvented later on as the threepenny.
The Threepenny Opera.
I was going to say the Threepenny Opera, and of course the Beggar's Opera was the original. So you have a lot of those sorts of things, and the general exploitation of folklore was a big thing for Britain, which we get a certain amount in Midsummer Night's Dream as well. Which is also another one that really features a great deal of trumpet music. He was very keen on the sound of the trumpet. There's a lot of trumpet in Britain.
Well, he also is greatly influenced by Henry Purcell, I believe. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, certainly The Young Person's Guide is an arrangement of a Purcell tune, and that was that tradition was very much sort of for Britain.
Once again, to quote Michael Flanders, his works were soon in rehearsal because he always used Ed Purcell.
There we go. We've got a lot of folk song arrangements, and also, of course, there's a whole album called Salute to Percy Grainger, in which Britain conducts, or among other people conducts, Grainger's arrangements of traditional English folk songs, and Peter Pears features very heavily on all of those as well. So it was certainly very present in him. He wasn't an urban composer. He wasn't attempting to be sort of I'm just trying to think who was really, but he wasn't attempting to be the sophisticate of, like, I suppose Shostakovich would be the sort of, in some ways, the complementary opposite at the time, in as much as he had been given very much a remit to to explore the modern things, Lady Macbeth and Potensk and all those sorts of things, which Britain looked much further back.
But I think Benjamin Britten's very much an absolute product of British society after the First World War, which is, if you could argue that countries like America and Germany represented modernism prior to the First World War and Britain represented tradition, after the First World War, although Britain was on the winning side, we were forced to, not forced to, but one of the natural corollaries of winning that war was in fact the triumph of modernism. But in Britain it's never been an absolute triumph. I don't mean it necessarily purely in its political or philosophical position, also in architecture, etc., etc. It's a full cultural wave, modernism. But Britain has never taken... Britain has always put one foot in modernism and one foot in its traditional past.
Yes.
And Benjamin Britten certainly seems to me to be almost
he sort
living
of sits
embodiment.
He does. He sits right on that line, so that the structures might have a certain, as it were, Bauhaus influence. But in fact, hark back strongly to in their content to the past. I agree.
And he can play. He can write beautifully melodic music, and he can play beautifully non-melodic music, and he's able to jump from back and forth in the same pieces.
Yes, and blend, I suppose, perhaps would be the critical thing about it, is that things... I mean, for example, if you look at sort of some of the, the effects that he used that you might not have used like a century before in opera, Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, opens in a wood, and there's a whole series of rather weird sounding, as in the harmonies are quite modernistic, but they're glissandi on the strings. So the cellos sort of start deep in the bottom of the notes that they can get
earthy
to.
Notes, in fact.
Very earthy notes, and so you'll have different stringed instruments sliding their way down the fretboard, as it were, or the fingerboard, to create,
which is not sound in itself, isn't it?
Well, what it sounds like is trees creaking.
Yeah,
and that's the effect that it creates in the beginning. So you've got this sense of this very sort of natural thing, but with this slightly unnerving, modernistic technique, I suppose you've got there, and it's very. You probably might have had that before the time that was written, because I think we're in 1960 by the time we get to Midsummer Night's Dream. But
it's still relatively innovative.
It just sounds weird without sounding particularly. It clearly means trees.
Yes,
it's not obscure. It's not sort of
You can interpret it if you're listening.
Art for art's sake, exactly. Very beautiful opera, Midsummer Night's Dream, and a big sort of throwback. There's actually a big section in the middle of it talking about paying tribute to tradition. Sorry, not in the middle, but in the final act, I should say, which is Pyramus and Thisbe. This is the play that the what they call the mechanicals, Bottom and Quince and so forth, and Starveling, all put on for the sophisticates of the Athenian court.
It's the play within the play.
The play within the play. That's right. Very popular with Shakespeare, as we know. Yeah. And so in the play, it's a sort of what the audience are laughing at is the amateurishness of the performers, and basically how terrible their play is, and how sort of inconsistent the language is, and all the rest of it. Yeah. Very amateurish. And so Britten uses this as an opportunity to send up some of the big operas of the 19th century.
Oh, right.
And,
a pop.
And so, for example, there's a Mad Song in there, which is based on the Mad Song from Lucia de Lammermoor, for example. And it's a very tuneful section of the thing. It's very joyous, and it just absolutely takes the mickey out of a lot of his operatic predecessors.
But isn't that interesting? Because, you've immediately said something that most people don't think of, which is, here's a man who's able to put comedy into opera. Yeah. I mean, that's not to say the whole arc of the operas are funny, but,
Well, now we come to the thing that Britain has particularly in common with musical theatre, and it's quite sort of deeply buried in the sort of, and it's not an obvious similarity. But one thing that you notice about him is that there are opera components. What is the difference between musical theatre and opera? To open up a very old chestnut.
Canard, yes.
And people often, one answer that is often given to that is that in an opera the music is more important, and in musical theatre the lyrics are more important, and one could argue about that all day and forever, and whether that applies to all the songs in every musical and all
it may not be true, but people say it. Yes,
there's a certain truth to it that I think people acknowledge. One of the things, therefore, that musical theatre often does, which opera doesn't do, is focus strongly on scansion and setting. So, for example, it matters in musical theatre very much whether the speech rhythm of a piece of lyric is set in a natural stress pattern, as opposed to just chucking the syllables on top of the tune you've already composed any old how and hoping that it'll all turn out very well. And Britten, in that sense, was a musical theatre writer because he knew how to do that, and he started from the text, and he wrote his tunes outward from the text, and so they are actually great settings. And I think it's very audible for an English listener, obviously, because if you listen to opera in foreign languages, you're not always going to appreciate
there's an extra level
how
of
well that's being done.
Right.
But it's always struck me that, particularly in A Midsummer Night's Dream, you notice it, but in all of his operas, there's a strong sense that the drama has co-precedence with the music, perhaps even if it's not the primary thing. And that's what makes it feel a little bit more like musical theatre than certainly a lot of the sort of 19th century opera or some other stuff. And as you say, that's what puts Albert Herring slightly on that side of Gilbert and Sullivan, perhaps more an operetta than it would put it on
Verdi.
Yes, that's right. Or the sort of the operetta of the time, which wasn't comic, and which was more Your Merry Widows and whatnot.
Which shows a range, doesn't it? I mean, and also his very last musical is a very, I think of as a modern piece, Death in Venice.
Yes.
His last opera, early 70s?
It was premiered at the Maltings in Snape on the 16th of June 1973. So yes, this was very much towards the end of Britten's life, and in a sense, I suppose there's a lot of resonance because, of course, we're seeing an elderly homosexual man,
yes,
with a real obsession for younger men, which we know that was certainly the case with Britten. We don't know how sexual an obsession it was, but we do know that it was certainly. It
would be safe to say that he found young boys to be his muse.
Yes, and sort of teenagers as well. Yeah. And he felt emotionally very connected to those. It's never been clear to say what the boundary was on that, and exactly what, other than we don't have anybody have talked about sort of much physical contact, but certainly he befriended boys as children, and he also made strong emotional connections to very young men, both prior to and indeed subsequent to sort of his settling down with Peter Pears, his lifelong partner. Here we have with the von Aschenbach perhaps a sort of emerging, if you like, a little bit from behind the cloud of discretion, if you like, that had governed this for the rest of his life.
But can I just make an observation, just a very simple? There may well, I don't know the history of Death in Venice, whether it was originally a book, but of course it's most famous as a film, I think, by Fellini. Yeah. And this is an opera based on an adaptation of a film. Now, in fact, it doesn't say late 20th, early 21st century musical theatre. Yeah. What does?
Indeed, yeah.
Darling!
Yes, indeed. Although the story itself was a little bit earlier, of course, of Thomas Mann. But yes,
that's certainly true. Yes, you're right. I mean, when you say it, it does ring a bell. But I still think, in the popular conception, it's a Fellini film first. Yeah.
So by this time we're seeing the twilight of the career of a great opera composer, and someone who'd written very much for, if you like, the serious stage, and for young voices, and that was another border that he was right on, was the sort of the folk, the stuff that happened in schools, and the stuff that happened in the opera houses, and was considered to be sort of the high intellectual treats, if you like.
I think that engagement with the public at all levels is the most interesting fact about Britten, and it takes me back to the Flanders and Swan sketch. I keep referring to it, but actually it's about 10 minutes, and it's the most perfect encapsulation of his career. But what it absolutely makes plain is that Flanders and Swan thought that a 10-minute musical sketch based on the career of Benjamin Britten would have enough understanding for speech marks to the great British public, even if only, as you say, the middle classes or the theatre-going public. But it had enough to make it worthwhile doing. It wasn't so desperately esoteric. And they talk about the turn of the screw, and they talk about Gloriana, and they talk about the folk songs, and they talk about the young person's guide to the orchestra. Everything that we've touched upon here, and a great deal more, was touched upon with Michael Flanders' traditional humour. But it was all understood. And so he's not this distant opera writer.
No.
He was a writer of opera that people would see and did see.
Yes, that's right. He basically became a sort of a key figure in the culture, I suppose.
Yeah. And the Lloyd Webber of his day.
Oh God, I hope not. No,
Well, in terms of
that was Julian Slade, I think.
Yeah. No, but in terms of longevity and touching all levels of
Yes,
the cultural society.
I think there's a degree of affection for Britten which is you don't really get for for many other composers actually, and British composers anyway.
Well, not always. I have to say, my late maths master at school hated Benjamin.
Oh well.
He used to interrupt maths lessons to tell us how much he hated Benjamin Britten.
Well, I hated maths lessons, so that's put paid to him. Far rather have listened to some Benjamin Britten than do any kind of maths at all. There we are.
But when you turn the screw, you do have to use trigonometry.
That's how it goes. Yes. It's been very interesting to go through all of the I say all of them, one or two of the aspects exactly of Benjamin Britten. It's fascinating to think that this is now going to be a figure from a previous century. Well, I mean,
yes.
Well, I mean, obviously he always was, but
having hit his centenary. When you bear in mind that 2 years ago we were commemorating the 100 years since the death of Gilbert, which is far history in terms of musical theatre. The fact that Britten was born only 2 years later.
Yeah, that's right. And that really he was just sort of finishing his career about the time that, well, I suppose actually
you were being born.
I was being born, and also that Lloyd Webber was sort of breaking through with a very new kind of seizing the theatre by the scruff of its neck and giving it a new type of approach. I don't know how it's difficult for us to say, what his influence is on musical theatre at large, but obviously the influence on opera was enormous, and that's affected. In some ways, it brought a little bit of that what I was talking about, that musical theatre approach into opera, and I think perhaps making people take text a lot more seriously, because these were true collaborations with his librettist Mavandri Piper and people like W.H. Auden as well. With whom, British of course, names, he also wrote Night Mail. And there's another example, actually, the GPO film Night Mail, of where the text and the music had a similar sort of level of... It was a documentary as well, of course, had a similar level of precedence in it. And that, perhaps, is a really big legacy of Britten.
I'm absolutely fascinated by that in fact, we seem to be boiling down to the fact, what you've just said, it's not so much that Benjamin Britten influenced musical theatre, but he took many of the tropes of musical theatre to influence opera. Yes,
I think that's probably fair. Well, thank you very much for joining me to talk through the life of one of our great composers, and
a Great Britain.
A Great Britain. There we are. That's got to leave it there, haven't we? That was Musical Talk. I was Tim Sayward. He was Thos Ribbards. That's it for us. And we will meet with you again in some future occasion.
This episode of Musical Talk, edited and produced by Thos Ribbards. Copyright Musical Talk 2013. You opened it, so you probably need to do the close down.
Is there anything I need to say?
I like fish fingers.
This wasn't I Like Fish Fingers production.
Brought to you by the letter Cod and Headache.
It's so short, it barely it flashes past in this bit. There's a prodigal son which I never heard of.
He'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Hey!